Sure, Léacht agus gribh agat as teacht sa stormsin agus now we're starting our Bergin lecture of this year, the Osborn Bergin Memorial Lecture, and our speaker today is Professor John Carey, who probably needs no introduction to anyone in this room, but just in case, he's the professor in early medieval Irish in University College Cork, so where I actually got my PhD with John. So he'll be talking to us about the settling of the men of Tara, text, context, background, reception. Just before John starts to entertain us with the huge repository of his knowledge on medieval Irish sagas or narratives, just two small things to say. Right, firstly, this year's lecture is also dedicated to Professor George Huxley, Léacht Huxley, who has long been a very loyal donor to the Osborn Bergin Lecture, who unfortunately passed away last year, I think in November the 30th, at the age of 86. So Professor Huxley was professor of mathematics and classics, so a very good combination of subjects in a few places, TCD and QUB among them. So last year, right before we were running our Bergin lecture, I wrote a letter inviting him to join, but Professor Huxley said due to health reasons he couldn't and wish he could be here. But right after the lecture, I received the news of his death. So that's very sad news. So we're holding this lecture in honor of Professor Huxley. The second thing is right after our lecture, we have two options. One is to go with Russian here to the university club, right? So you enjoy some drinks on us. The second option is in room K114, right above, well, not right above us, the first floor. There will be a lecture by Alva Johnson in the O'Clery seminar. So that's the title is Epigraphic Habits, Literacy and Communications in late antique Ireland. So if anyone is interested in going directly to that lecture, you can follow me, and I will lead you to Alva Johnson's lecture. And afterward, we'll meet again in the in the university club, right? So to get a few drinks. So now, without further ado, I'll hand it to John to our settling of Men of Tara. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Well, thank you, Fangzhe, and indeed thanks to all of you for making it here through the elements. It's a great honor and a real pleasure to be contributing to this prestigious lecture series, instituted in memory of the scholar who is surely Cork's greatest gift to Celtic studies. I'm also honored, but at the same time saddened, to be giving a lecture dedicated to the memory of Professor George Huxley. I only met Professor Huxley on a few occasions, but was always struck by his warmth and courtesy, as well as by his interest in and support for our field. In her obituary of Osborn Bergin, Eleanor Knott observed that his time and his abilities were always at the disposal of pupils and colleagues in their difficulties. Thus, a large part of his energies, too large, some of us mournfully reflect, was absorbed in work of an unseen kind, which affected and benefited to an important degree the publications of others. But even if unseen, such work did not always go unacknowledged. Thus, Richard Irvine Best, in the introduction to his edition of the text, Deireadh Fómhair Thevra, or The Settling of the Manor of Tara, wrote that my thanks are due to Professor Kuno Meyer and Dr. Bergin for renderings of several difficult passages, especially in the verse portions, and for constant advice. Best and Bergin, of course, went on to collaborate on various notable projects thereafter. I expect that many of you have at least some familiarity with Deireadh Fómhair Thevra, which I'll be referring as STT in what follows. But however familiar STT may be, it appears not to have been the subject of much sustained scholarly discussion. In his monumental Clavis, the late Donacha O'Corroin cites only 3 articles as literature devoted to the tale, and in 2 out of these 3, only a page or 2 relate to STT itself. O'Corroin's listing is not exhaustive. Thus, the absence of the brothers Alvin and Brinley Rees and of Grigory Bondarenko is conspicuous, but he has not omitted much. Moreover, the text has almost never been examined for its own sake, the only exception of which I am aware being the essay contributed by Daniel Watson, as it happens the current Bergin Fellow at the Institute, to the forthcoming collection Classical Antiquity and Medieval Ireland. It's my aim to present such an examination here. First, however, a brief synopsis of the story may be useful. STT opens in the reign of King Diarmait mac Cearbhail in the 6th century, and with that king's desire to convene the great assembly known as the Feis Tevril, this being presumably the famous occasion of the last celebration of the Feis, assigned by the annals to the year 558 or 560. The men of Ireland refused to attend until the proper extent of the territory of Tara has been definitively established. To ascertain this, Diarmid successively summons Flann Fevla, Bishop of Armagh, then the famous scholar Cenmhailh mac Allala, then the 5 elders of Ireland, and at last Fintan mac Bochra, who has existed in Ireland since before the flood. Asked to establish his credentials as an ancient, Fintan relates an anecdote demonstrating that he is far older than an enormous yew tree. As Eminic Carhaig has noted, this is to be understood in light of the claim made in other sources that the yew is the oldest of all living creatures. Fintan proceeds to speak of an earlier assembly at Tara, in the reign of Conang Begeglach, here synchronized with the crucifixion of Christ, to which there came a mysterious giant named Tre'elnydd Tre'ocha. This stranger claimed to be responsible for the movements of the sun, and was subsequently said to have been an angel, or perhaps God himself. In the presence of all of the men of Ireland, Tre'elnydd ascertained from Fintan the characteristics of each of the fifths of Ireland, and then specified the extent of each fifth by naming a series of its notable places. The arrangement thus arrived at was to endure forever. After Tre'elnydd's departure, Fintan planted berries from a branch which the giant had carried, from which grew 5 extraordinary trees. With the withering of these trees, he realized that old age had come upon himself as well, but he survived long enough to hand his knowledge on at the assembly held by Diarmid. He then marked out the boundaries of the fifths on a pillar stone at Ishnach and returned to his home in Kerry to end his days. It is suggested, however, that he did not die, but was conveyed bodily to some divine concealment, like Enoch and Elijah. In the remarks that follow, I will adopt a sequence somewhat different from that of this lecture's title. After examining STT itself, and in particular any indications of its date, I'll proceed to look for traces of its influence elsewhere in the literature. I will then attempt to situate the work in its cultural context, and will conclude with some thoughts concerning its potential sources and deeper background. On the question of date, Sean McArt observed that the tale seems to have been known under some form or another in the 11th century. It was one of those told at the fair of Carman. He was alluding to a reference to a scéal teli thevra in the apparently 11th century Dinhenicus poem, Éistíð a Léacht Léacht, a description of the luchtness of assembly, or oinach, at Carmen. It's presumably on the same basis that Kim McCone has spoken of STT as a roughly 10th or 11th century narrative, an opinion echoed by Idel Vranach and by Grigory Bondarenko. In 1994, I impressionistically wrote of the tale as being probably 10th century. A few years later, more cautiously, I simply called it Middle Irish, observing, however, the fact that it does not appear to have been influenced by Leabhar Gavala or by the 10th and 11th century poems on which that work is primarily based, inclines me to suspect that it was composed before these texts had come to exercise a pervasive influence. Donogh Corran, by contrast, assigned STT to the 12th century. This is also the view of Daniel Watson, who argues that it reflects the influence of Hugh of St. Victor and or Otto of Freising, both of whom lived in the first half of that century. The topic is, accordingly, ripe for re-examination. MacArt's suggestion that the poem on the Oinach of Carmen may refer to STT offers a promising starting point, especially if Edward Gwynne was correct in suggesting that this poem may have been composed to mark the holding of the Oinach in the year 1079. As MacArt's wording seems to have been known under some form or another, indicates, however, we cannot be certain that it is our text, or even perhaps anything closely resembling our text, to which the poem refers. So other approaches are called for. One obvious criterion of date is STT's language, some aspects of which we can now consider. STT survives in 3 manuscripts. In a segment of the Yellow Book of Lecan, written by Léacht MacFirvishi in 1391, in the Book of Lismore, in the hand of the scribe Angus O'Cullenane, writing late in the 15th century, and in the composite manuscript TCD 1336, dating probably from the 16th century. Best did not use, or indeed mention, the third of these. At various points, TCD 1336 agrees with the Yellow Book against Lismore, but also vice versa. It is clearly an independent witness whose testimony will be crucial to any future edition. The orthography of all 3 copies reflects the scribal practice of the times in which they were executed, but it is nevertheless easy to recognize in them the language of an earlier period. As has been universally recognized, this language is Middle Irish. Thus, there are many instances of univerbation. The deponent has almost wholly disappeared, but deponent endings have spread to the preterite and to the first singular subjunctive of originally non-deponent verbs. The new future first-person singular ending fed and the new preterite second-person plural ending ver are both present. There is an example of the spread of the long E future to verbs with consonant clusters resulting from syncope. The new hybrid infixed pronoun dos has appeared, and the distinctive dative plural ending of the definite article has been lost. On the other hand, Pache, O'Corran, and Watson, there are several indications that STT does not belong to the later part of the Middle Irish period. Thus, it has no examples of the use of dental endings in old yo and ya stems, or of the use of independent pronouns to designate the object or subject of the verb, both developments beginning in the 11th century. The numeral 2 appears as D when feminine, a distinctive form already beginning to disappear in Saltern Iran, with the latest example noted by Liam Branagh appearing in a poem by Flann Manustra, who died in 1056. Preservation of the old inflection of an R stem in nominative plural shenather points in the same direction, with the latest instance noted by Branagh belonging to recension 2 of Toggle Troy, for which Walter McGarrett has proposed a date not later than 1106. STT also has instances of the old form in or ind for the nominative plural masculine of the definite article, increasingly rare in the course of the 11th century, and of inna for later na, a form of which the 11th century Aisling Conglina offers only 2 specimens, themselves perhaps fossils. Univerbation, although extensively present in the text, has a relatively early profile. Most examples either belonging to the type tig from do ig, already present in Old Irish, or univerbating by prefixing no or ra, a usage already copiously attested in Saltern Iran. There are, moreover, still plenty of deuterotonic forms, involving not only verbs which have retained deuterotonic flexion into the modern language, but also several others. Although some old strong verbs have adopted weak flexion, there are still several examples of the S subjunctive, together with the dental preterite, the reduplicated preterite, and other strong preterite formations. Further linguistic indications, although there are not enough of them to allow for a conclusive judgment, seem to favor a date in the 10th century rather than the 11th. Thus, apart from instances that reflect the old verbal ending in olshiad and kadhiad, STT has no examples of the new third plural pronoun iad or shiad, of which there is already a specimen in Saltern Iran. Although one of the poems in our text appears to have an example of infixed D as a relative marker, a usage attested in the Psalter, it has none of infixed S used in this way, introduced in the 11th century. There are also instances of the present third plural relative ending de, already rare in the Psalter, and of sid rather than sud as an absolute preterite third plural ending, very rare in Middle Irish, according to Branagh. These are isolated forms, some of them in poems which in theory could antedate the prose. In the aggregate, however, they all point in the same direction. In this connection, notice should be taken of 2 endings, which could be taken to point to a somewhat later date. Conjunct present third singular an or en, held by Tournaisen, who had emerged in the 11th century, and preterite third plural passive id, for which Branagh notes no examples in the Psalter, with the earliest instance in the Annals of Ulster appearing in an entry for 1014. Branagh has presented persuasive evidence that the former ending was in fact in use in the 10th century, conceivably indeed quite early in that century. But David Green's contention that there are 2 instances of the latter ending, passive id, in the Psalter has not found acceptance. With the single exception of that ending, however, I see nothing in the language of STT that is discrepant from that of Saltern Iran, generally taken to date from the late 10th century. So far as linguistic considerations can guide us accordingly, we can regard our text as having probably been composed early in the 11th century, or perhaps late in the 10th. There is accordingly no reason not to think that it is being alluded to in Éistíodh a Léacht, although we still cannot be sure of this. Are there other indications in the literature of familiarity with STT? The most obvious example of its influence is the lengthy poem Arsydd Sin a Ein Acla. This is currently being edited by my colleague Emmet Carey, who's inclined to date it to the 13th century. Framed as a dialogue between Fintan mac Bóithre and the equally long-lived Hawk of Achill, Arsydd Sin extends to 116 quatrains. In 23 of these, Fintan relates how the giant tOllamh came to the assembly held at Tara by Conang Begeglach. Although the poem omits much of what is narrated in STT and provides details of its own, there is no doubt that the former is drawing on the latter. Thus, what tOllamh says in STT about the eastern and western thresholds of the sun is faithfully rendered in the poem. Edward Gwynne proposed that STT was also the source of a considerably more prominent text, the Akessos narrative, introducing the corpus of toponymic legends known as Dinhanicus Éireann, in which it's related how a poet induced Fintan to relate the place name lore of Ireland at an assembly convened by Diarmid at Tara. As Gwynne observed, some of the same personages are employed: Diarmid MacCareful, Fintan mac Bóithre, Ken Violeth, Flan Fevla. This suggestion seems eminently plausible. Immediately following the Akessos, in the Book of Ballymote and in the Wren manuscript, but separated from it by another poem in most of the other witnesses, is the poem Tefer Breg Gcuimhne Deireadh. In its final quatrain, the speaker identifies himself as Fintan, and earlier on, he invokes the authority of Dovon, Finchith, Bran, Cualaz, and Tuon, the same 5 elders who defer to Fintan in STT. While it's possible that both STT and the poem derived these names from some earlier source, the association with Fintan and the textual proximity of the Akessos speak in favor of STT's priority here. A resemblance of a very different kind is afforded by the Finn tale Tochmharc Alva. This contains a description of the attendance at an assembly convened at Tara by Cormac MacArt, and of the provisions served to the different categories of guests, which is almost word for word the same as that found in STT, save that one of the categories in STT, that of charioteers, jesters, and rabble, is omitted in Tochmharc Alva. Given that STT is a text centrally concerned with the nature and privileges of the kingship of Tara, it seems likelier that this descriptive passage originated there and was adopted by the author of Tochmharc Alva than that the converse was the case. But if Tochmharc Alva did borrow from STT in this way, there are significant implications for our understanding of STT itself. For Tochmharc Alva is, by general consensus, regarded as a 10th century composition. This view is based not only on linguistic considerations, but also on the tale's inclusion in the Middle Irish tale lists, while Gregory Toner has presented arguments for a revision of our understanding of the textual history of these lists, with consequences for the potential dating of some of their contents. He regards the mention of Tochmharc Alva as belonging to the original text, dated by common consent to around the year 1000. Tochmharc Alva would, on this understanding, have been composed before this date, and STT earlier still. Although the fact that Tochmharc Alva has only survived in its entirety in a single manuscript, apparently of the 16th century, renders confident comparison difficult, it can at least be said that its language does not appear to be incompatible with such a scenario. Thus, in the passage that they share, Indri agus ind Olivin, the old form of the article in STT, can be contrasted with na rig agus na Olivin in Tochmharc Alva, and plural tini in the former contrasts with tinitha with dental ending in the latter. As I've mentioned, the preterite third plural passive ending id appears to be the latest diagnostic feature in STT. It's also found in Tochmharc Alva. The later third plural independent pronoun iad or shead, not present in STT, is found in Tochmharc Alva. And a more thorough analysis of the tale's language, which would in any case be welcome, would very possibly bring further significant features to light. Yet another text with an evident connection to STT is aithne Fingin, a frame tale that enumerates a series of wondrous events that are supposed to have accompanied the birth of the legendary king Cormac mac Art. One of these is that the tree Mughna, which had been concealed from human eyes since the time of the flood, became visible. It is said to be a son of the tree from paradise, or perhaps it is from a berry from the branch that was in the hand of Treilngeth that grew after it was planted by Fintan mac Bochra in the reign of Conang Begeglach. It'll be seen that the statement linking the tree with the events of STT is presented as an alternative explanation of its origin. And indeed, the incompatibility of such a linkage with the opening assertion that the tree had been in Ireland since the time of the flood indicates that the association is secondary. In fact, this passage is not present in the copy of aithne Fingin in RIA manuscript D42, the manuscript placed highest in the stemma by the tale's editor, Joseph Vendries. Whatever the date of the text's original composition, Fintan's encounter with Treilngeth appears to have been added at a subsequent stage of its development. At an even later stage, the extended genealogy, making Fintan the great-great-great-grandson of Ham, son of Noah, found at the end of STT, was added to aithne Fingin's account of Fintan himself. And the H-hand, or one of the H-hands, added the same genealogy in a margin of Lever na Hithra's copy of the tract Kethri Arda in Dovin. Two general conclusions can be drawn from the foregoing: that STT appears indeed to be a work of the 10th century, and that even though it has only come down to us in 3 copies, it was well known and influential in the early Middle Ages. Its date accordingly places STT at a relatively early point in the development of Ireland's legendary history. The most important Irish pseudo-historical text, Lever Gabhala Éireann, belongs to the 11th century. How does STT's picture of Irish origins compare with what we find in this later work? Where STT shares a poem with Lever Gabhala's Recension A, the correspondence is naturally close. But even here, it is not exact. In other respects, matters are yet more complex. In Éiriú Cia Iarfidher Dím, the poem thus shared, Fintan gives an outline picture of the settlements of Ireland, which, not surprisingly, is essentially the same as that provided elsewhere in Leabhar Gavala. First comes Kesser, with 3 men, her father Bith, Láithriú, and Fintan himself, and 50 girls, then Partholón, then Nevis MacAlcanavin, then the Firvolg, subdivided into Firvolg proper, Gallioin, and Firdhovnan, then the Tuath Day in masses of dark mists, and finally the Gaels, led by the sons of Nial from Spain. But the poem's statement that Kesir and all of her companions apart from Fintan were drowned by the flood is simpler than what we find in later accounts. Recension A of Leabhar Gavala holds that Láithriú was the first to die and that Bith was buried in Sliabh Betha, while Recension B tells a considerably more complicated story, which culminates with Kesir too dying of grief 7 days before the flood takes place. Also worth noting is the statement that Partholón came to Ireland from the land of the Greeks. There's nothing exactly corresponding to this elsewhere in Leabhar Gavala. It is the position of the 9th century Scéal Dúin Vic Carroll. The next poem in STT, this Yol Domsa Sun Amne, is concerned with judgments. The first judgment in creation, pronounced by God upon the devil, the judgments of the law and of the prophets, represented by Moses and David, respectively, and the new covenant of Christianity. Between David and Christ come figures from Irish legendary history. Féinius Fársith, ancestor of the Gaels, and his disciple Cai Cainmhreathach are said to have been responsible for the 72 languages, a variant on the usual teaching that Féinius constructed the Irish language from the best elements in the 72 languages that came into being at the Tower of Babel. The poem goes on to recount the first judgment concerning Tara, the story, familiar from Leabhar Gavala, of how Avragan son of Miel judged between his brothers and the 3 Tuath Day kings at Tara, decreeing that the Gaels should put out to sea again, crossing 9 waves. The sons of Miel are, unusually, here said to have been 4 in number, evidently not counting Avragan. Don and Ir, who died in the process of landing, and Eivor and Eirivon, who went on to rule Ireland between them. With this may be contrasted Recension A, Leabhar Gavala, which reckons 7 sons of Miel, the poem Canamunadas na Gaidhil by Maelmhor Aithne, who died in 887, where there are 6, and the sketch of Ireland's past in the Cambro-Latin Historia Bretonum of around 830, where there are 3. In the prose of STT, Conang Begaglach responds to Tretling's questions with an extended account of the origins and wanderings of the Gaels. Here, it's interesting, the ancestors of the Gaels are said to have been not Scythians, as in Leabhar Gavala, but Greeks, reflecting a doctrine that has been examined at length in an important article by Bart Yaski. In Can Amunathas, Féinius comes from Scythia, but is of Greek ancestry. Indeed, Maelmhor's words, "Dogregiv dún con our munath," we are Greeks with our origin, seem to be echoed in Conang's Dogregiv our munath. There may be another such echo in the use of the phrase liverna foreign for the ships of Pharaoh that the Gaels steal in order to escape from Egypt. The clearest evidence of the poem's influence on this part of STT would, at first glance, seem to be a quatrain quoted directly from the poem, deriving the population names Féini, Gaithel, and Squit from the legendary ancestors Féinius, Gaithel, and Scotta. But this stanza is only cited in one of the three manuscripts of the tale, in the Yellow Book of Lecan, and seems accordingly to be a later addition. One further detail in Conang's narrative is not paralleled anywhere else to my knowledge, that the Gaels arrived in Ireland in the 9th year after their departure from Egypt. This differs radically from what we find either in Canamonidus or in the various versions of Lever Gavala. And indeed, the Book of Lismore copy of STT alters the figure to 467. That it is the Book of Lismore which is innovating here is evident from a passage later on in the tale, where Fintan is made to say that he was alone for 1,002 years after the flood. This is interesting, as the same figure is given for the interval between the flood and the arrival of Partholón in Scéal Duáin. The Book of Lismore copy of STT, however, gives the figure as 1,352, stating thereafter that, and I quote, "There is a contradictory synchronism in another place, for he says 1,002 years, and according to gcuimhne in Éiriú Ard, it is 311 years," end quote. After this explicit rejection of the doctrine affirmed in the other two manuscripts, which is thus shown to have been that of the exemplar, the Book of Lismore goes on to give a detailed chronology of the remaining settlements, most of the figures in which agree with those in gcuimhne's poem Éiriú Ard Inis na Ríg. This is not all of the lore concerning ancient Ireland that STT has to offer. The poem Fan Iniu Movetha Buan, in particular, gives a further, in some respects, rather puzzling account of the sequence of the settlements. And the text's synchronization of the reign of Conang Begeglach with the crucifixion is jarringly at odds with other medieval Irish chronologies, where he is made contemporary with Persian kings of the 5th century BC. I am, however, conscious that time is also passing for us here, and so I'll turn to the last of my four main areas of inquiry, the question of STT's deeper background. The basic framework of the text, which brings the antediluvian Fintan mac Bóithre, the court of a Christian king, so that he can pass his knowledge on, dying thereafter under the benevolent auspices of the church, is designed to bring native lore concerning the past into harmony with ecclesiastical learning and with a Christian worldview. Confronted with such a balance between the archaic and the clerical, most scholars have been inclined to focus on the former, which, to be fair, is the focus of the text as well. Sean McArt, inspired by T.F. O'Reilly's réchauffé of the solar theories of Max Müller, argued that the mysterious Tretlingith was actually a Celtic sun god, while their brothers Alwyn and Brinley Rees interpreted STT's account of the qualities associated with the Fifths of Ireland as a mapping onto the landscape of a quasi-Dumezilian framework of Indo-European social classes. Charles Doherty, while acknowledging that STT has incorporated biblical material, has been harmonized with Christian chronology, and has a strong apocalyptic quality, nevertheless roundly asserts that it must have been originally part of a pagan cosmogony. And Diego Poli speaks of its mythic cosmological character. Grigory Bondarenko, while noting important links between aspects of STT and Judeo-Christian apocryphal traditions, proposes that the ultimate basis of the narrative may be the ancient tOllamh ritual, as analysed by Thomas Charles Edwards. Such approaches have not gone uncriticised. Thus, Kim McCone has objected that even a cursory reading of this thoroughgoing synthetic historical text, which pullulates with explicit Christian and biblical references, reveals it as a particularly elaborate and ambitious attempt to integrate Irish Seanchas with Christian world history through the agency of Fintan. I would like to approach the question from a somewhat different angle. At the heart of STT, as the Rhys brothers recognized, is the dialogue between tOllamh and Fintan concerning the fifths. It is this which resolves the issue with which the text began, and after it has taken place, it is described as an arrangement, an ordogus, to which the men of Ireland will be subject forever. Another version of this dialogue exists as a separate text in Laud Miscellany 610, and the first 10 lines of this tract were also added at the end of the Book of Lismore's copy of STT to fill the remainder of a column. Here, the interlocutors are not tOllamh and Fintan, but Fintan and Cenmhailh. On the face of it, this autonomous copy of the kernel of STT, presenting Fintan's description of the fifths in a far simpler framework, looks like the source that served as STT's starting point. As Meyer pointed out, the interrogatio is quoted in the Yellow Book of Lechan's copy of Sanus Cormac, which gives Iris Fis, Tuithshis Cath, knowledge to the west of it, battle to the north of it, as an example of the word Iris. This entry is part of the expanded version of Sanus Cormac, and thus does not belong to that glossary's first compilation, probably in the later 9th century. It is also found in the longer version of the related glossary, Dúil Dromacheta. But while the interrogatio's citation by the glossaries cannot be used as evidence of date, aspects of its wording can. Brief and dominated by lists of names though it is, the text affords several indications of relatively early composition. Ubiquitous affection, absence of univerbation, use of no, preservation of deponent flexion, use of the class C infixed pronoun, preservation of the superlative ending, and use of the suffix pronoun. It is evidently Old Irish, not Middle Irish. If STT is based on the conversation between Fintan and Cenmhailh in the interrogatio, then the rest of this elaborate work is to be regarded as embroidery, added by the 10th century author. Diarmaid's convening of the assembly at Tara, and here the fact that Diarmaid reigned 2 generations before Cenmhailh and 3 before Flann Fevla, is a further reflection of artificiality. The introduction of the 5 elders, the earlier assembly convened by Conang Begeglach, a remarkable and anomalous figure of tOllamh, the sketches of Ireland's legendary history and of the origins of the Gaels, furnished by Fintan and Conang, the erection of the stone at Uisneach, and the origin of the ancient trees. In saying this, I am not deprecating the importance of these elements, which continue to pose intriguing questions for future research. I wish only to stress that, in an inquiry into the origins of STT itself, they must be regarded as ancillary. By way of conclusion, then, I'll focus on what we find in the interrogatio. Fintan begins with a formulaic description of Ireland, which may perhaps antedate the interrogatio itself. Knowledge to the west of it, battle to the north of it, prosperity to the east of it, music to the south of it, sovereignty over it. The adverbs eros, tuothus, arthius, desus, and forthus are only attested in the interrogatio, and by derivation therefrom in STT and in the glossary citations. Building on an observation by Maud Joint and Eleanor Knott, Paul Russell has shown that these words have their basis in an analogical extension of the system of suffixed pronouns, and accordingly, as he says, must have been created at a period when suffixed pronouns were still productive, that is, no later than the early Old Irish period. In response to Ken Viola's questions, Fenton then assigns further attributes and qualities to each of these regions, together with lists of places contained in them. As I've mentioned, the Rhys brothers have interpreted the characteristics of the regions at some length, but I'm not aware that anyone has looked at the accompanying geographical information. Although not all of the names can be confidently identified, those concerning which there is no doubt provide us with a general picture, and it is a peculiar one. While the interrogatio's west is Connacht, as would be expected, its north is limited to the territories of the northern Ineo and to Erhiela, while its east is the truncated Ulster of the early Middle Ages, confined almost entirely to counties Antrim, Down, and Louth. South comprises names from both Leinster and Munster, and remarkably, Tara itself comes at the head of the list. The territory assigned to the centre, the Meathone, is mainly confined to Westmeath, with a few places in Meath and Offaly. STT adjusts this anomalous distribution somewhat. For the south, the only Leinster place names are in the west of the province, with many Munster names added, especially in counties Cork and Kerry, while the names for the centre now include Tara and extend throughout Brega. But north, west, and east remain largely as in the interrogatio, meaning that this version mentions few places in Leinster. How are we to understand this? This is a question best addressed by toponymists and historians. I'm neither, and my thoughts are correspondingly tentative. The interrogatio presents us with an Ireland in which Munster and Leinster are united, and in which the territory of the southern Ineo is so reduced as no longer to include Tara itself. This suggests a situation, actual or aspirational, in which a ruler of Leath Mogha, the southern half of Ireland, would have had ambitions for the high kingship. Such a situation appears, in fact, to be reflected in the annals. In 831, Feddlimid Becrivthan, the devout but ferocious King Bishop of Munster, whom O'Coroyne has called one of the most colourful characters in the whole of Irish history, led the armies of both Munster and Leinster on a raid into Brega. I do not propose anything so neat as a direct connection between this specific event and the interrogatio, but the latter could well have been composed as propaganda for a mood of Munster expansionism at that time. Linguistically, I could see nothing against such a correlation. At all events, Feddlimid's moment passed, and when, in the following century, the interrogatio was revised for inclusion in STT, the changes in the new version reflected a rather more conventional political vision. It's time to bring this lecture to its close. Obviously, and inevitably, I have by no means answered all of the questions raised by Deireadh Fómhair. I hope, however, that some of the observations made this afternoon may provide a firmer basis for further study of this fascinating text. Thanks very much.